The grand city square was buzzing with excitement. It was a beautiful late afternoon, with the sun starting to set behind the royal palace. The orange and pink hues of the sky reflected off the buildings and danced across the cobblestone streets. People from all over the kingdom had gathered, their voices filling the air with laughter, chatter, and the sound of music playing in the background. The royal family had arranged a special event to celebrate the kingdom's anniversary, and the entire city seemed to be involved. Eliza stood on the edge of the crowd, looking out at the lively scene before her. She wasn't quite sure how she had ended up here. A month ago, she would have loved to be in the middle of the action, smiling and chatting with friends, enjoying the festivities. But that was before her father's passing, before everything had changed in her life. Her father had been a prominent man, respected by everyone. As the head of their noble family, he had always been strong, wise, and kind, a pillar of support for her and the rest of the family. He had taught her many things: how to walk with grace, how to handle difficult situations, and most importantly, how to be strong, even when it felt impossible. But now he was gone. His sudden illness had taken him from her, and Eliza was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart, trying to understand how to move on without the person who had always been her rock. Despite the beautiful day and the royal celebrations, Eliza felt a deep emptiness inside. She had to be here. It was expected of her. The noble families were required to show up at these events no matter what. But as she stood there, surrounded by people, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of place. Her dress, an elegant shade of blue that had once made her feel confident and proud, now felt too heavy, as if it was weighing her down. She pulled the fabric closer to her body, trying to hide the ache inside. Everyone around her seemed to be enjoying themselves, talking and laughing. They were all so alive, so full of energy, while Eliza felt like a ghost among them. The sound of the royal trumpet suddenly filled the air, announcing the arrival of the royal family. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had been raised to understand the importance of royal events, and this one was particularly significant. The king and queen were here, along with their children, the young prince and princess. Eliza knew she should be excited, maybe even honored, to be in the presence of the royal family, but instead, she felt like a stranger in a world that no longer made sense to her. She watched as the king and queen made their way to the grand stage set up at the far end of the square, smiling and waving at the crowd. People cheered, and Eliza could see the joy in their faces. They were happy, and why wouldn't they be? The kingdom was thriving, and the royal family was loved by all. But for Eliza, the world felt different now. She missed her father. The world felt quieter, emptier without his presence. Her eyes began to well up, and she quickly blinked the tears away, not wanting anyone to notice. She didn't want to show weakness in front of the crowd, especially not here, not at such an important event. She tried to take a deep breath, reminding herself of what her father would have said if he were here. You must stand tall no matter the storm that rages within. But standing tall was harder than ever. The grief was heavy on her chest, and every breath felt like an effort. As the king and queen took their places on the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Eliza tried to join in, but the sound felt distant in her ears. She clapped slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she should care more, should be more involved, but all she could think about was her father. How would he have reacted to this event? What would he have said about the celebrations? She glanced around again, noticing how everyone seemed to fit into their roles so perfectly. The men were chatting and laughing, dressed in their finest suits. The women looked radiant in their colorful gowns, talking with each other as if everything in their lives was perfect. There was an energy in the air that Eliza couldn't quite grasp. She felt out of sync with everything around her, as though she was watching the world unfold from a distance. The crowd's laughter grew louder, and Eliza felt a tightness in her throat. She couldn't stand the noise anymore. She couldn't pretend to be part of it. The tears that she had been holding back suddenly overwhelmed her. She tried to turn away from the crowd, but it was too late. The emotions had taken over, and before she knew it, she was sinking to her knees in the middle of the square. Eliza's sobs were quiet at first, but they quickly grew louder as the weight of her grief consumed her. She was no longer able to hold back the flood of emotions. She had spent so much time trying to be strong, trying to keep the appearance of a noble lady who could handle anything life threw at her. But now, in the middle of the crowd, with the sound of the royal music and the laughter of others around her, All of her strength seemed to disappear. She felt as if she was being swallowed by the sadness that had taken over her life. It was a sadness she couldn't escape. It had followed her everywhere since the day her father had passed. She had tried to go on with her duties, tried to smile at the right moments, but it was getting harder and harder to pretend that everything was fine. Her hands were trembling as she wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. The people around her barely seemed to notice. They were too caught up in the event, too focused on the royal family to see the young woman who was breaking down in front of them. As Eliza sat there, her head in her hands, she felt utterly alone. She wanted to scream, to tell someone how much she missed her father, but the words caught in her throat. She felt as though she was drowning in a sea of expectations with no one to turn to. The world around her moved on while she was stuck in her grief. It was in that moment, as she sat there in the midst of the celebration, that something unexpected happened. A figure appeared before her. At first, Eliza didn't notice, too caught up in her own sorrow. But then a voice broke through the fog of her mind. "Are you all right, miss?" the voice asked, soft but firm. Eliza looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting the gaze of a royal guard. He was tall, standing at attention with a calm expression on his face. His uniform was impeccable, a deep shade of navy with golden accents that caught the light from the sunset. The man's face was kind but serious, his eyes filled with understanding. I don't know," Eliza whispered, her voice shaky. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he simply crouched down beside her and gave her a moment of silence. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a quiet presence that seemed to offer a strange comfort. The noise of the crowd faded into the background as she realized that, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was truly listening to her. The guard didn't push her to speak or to get up. He simply sat there beside her, offering her a moment of peace. In that simple act of kindness, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in this world. Eliza's heart still raced in her chest as she sat on the cold stone steps, her face hidden behind trembling hands. The laughter of the crowd and the royal fanfare felt so far away now. It was almost as if she was in a different world, one where the sounds and the people couldn't reach her. The only thing that remained was the heavy weight of grief pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. She had no idea how long she had been sitting there, lost in her sorrow. But when she finally wiped her eyes and looked up, the royal guard was still standing in front of her. His face remained calm, but there was a softness in his eyes, an understanding that Eliza had not expected from someone in his position. Guards were usually strict, stoic figures who kept their distance from the royal guests, never showing much emotion. But this man, he was different. For a brief moment, Eliza felt embarrassed. She quickly glanced around, wondering if anyone had noticed her breakdown. She had always prided herself on being composed, maintaining the dignity of her family name. Yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She had lost control, and it had happened in front of strangers. She couldn't even begin to explain how it had all come rushing out. The guard, noticing her discomfort, didn't move closer. He simply waited, his gaze steady and patient. His presence was like a gentle anchor in the midst of the storm inside her. There was no rush for her to speak, no pressure to explain what had happened. He wasn't judging her, and that gave her a small sense of relief. Eliza took a shaky breath and wiped away the last of her tears. She felt embarrassed, but there was something about the guard's quiet demeanor that made her want to trust him. It wasn't often she allowed herself to be vulnerable around others. She had learned from a young age that emotions could be a weakness, especially for someone in her position. The guard cleared his throat softly, his voice low and gentle. "Are you sure you're all right, miss?" he asked again. Eliza hesitated, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to say, "Yes, I'm fine," and pretend everything was okay, but she knew that would be a lie. Instead, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know," she confessed. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but they were the truth. The guard didn't push her further. Instead, he gave a small nod and stepped back slightly, allowing her space. It was such a simple gesture, but it made her feel less trapped in her own emotions. His respect for her privacy, even in her most vulnerable moment, was unexpected and somehow comforting. For a few minutes, they sat in silence. The bustling noise of the crowd continued in the distance, but it felt muted, as though they were in their own little world. Eliza glanced up at the man sitting next to her. He was taller than most, with broad shoulders and a posture that suggested strength and discipline. But there was a kindness in his eyes that softened his otherwise stoic appearance. She noticed the royal crest embroidered on his uniform, a symbol of his allegiance to the crown. His uniform was neat and well-maintained, the dark blue fabric glimmering slightly in the fading light. Yet despite his position as a royal guard, there was no sense of superiority about him. It was as if he didn't see her as a noblewoman or a member of the royal family, but simply as a person who was struggling and needed a moment of peace. After a while, Eliza spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you," she said, still unsure how to express her gratitude. "I didn't expect," she trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. She had been prepared for strangers to avoid her, to pretend not to notice her breakdown. But this man hadn't turned away. Instead, he had stayed, offering her the space she needed to process her emotions. The guard gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a broad smile, but it was enough to show that he understood. "There's no need to thank me, miss," he replied softly. "Sometimes we all need a little time to gather ourselves." His words resonated with Eliza in a way she didn't expect. She had been so focused on holding everything together, on not showing weakness, that she had forgotten it was okay to feel lost, to feel vulnerable. She had been carrying the weight of her father's death alone, not letting anyone in, not even those closest to her. But in this moment with this stranger, she realized it was okay to let go, even if just for a little while. For a few more minutes, the two of them sat in silence, the only sound being the distant chatter of the crowd and the rustling of the leaves in the nearby trees. Eliza's heart began to slow, and the tightness in her chest started to loosen. It was as though the presence of the guard had helped her feel less alone, less overwhelmed by the world around her. Finally, Eliza took a deep breath and stood up, feeling steadier on her feet than she had in hours. She turned to the guard, offering him a small, grateful smile. "I'll be all right now," she said, her voice a little stronger. "Thank you for being here." The guard nodded once more, his expression calm and respectful. "I'm glad I could help, miss," he replied, standing up as well. "If you ever need a moment again, you know where to find me." Eliza was surprised by how sincere his words sounded. He wasn't offering empty pleasantries or trying to make her feel better with meaningless words. There was a genuine kindness in his voice that made her believe him. For a moment, Eliza felt an unexpected connection with this royal guard, someone she had never met before and likely would never see again. Yet in that brief exchange, something had changed in her. She felt a little lighter, as though the heavy weight of grief had been lifted, even if just for a moment. With a final nod, the guard turned and made his way back toward the crowd. Eliza watched him go, feeling a strange sense of gratitude toward him. She wasn't sure if she would ever see him again, but she knew that his kindness would stay with her. As she stood there, watching the event continue in the distance, Eliza realized something important. She didn't have to go through this alone. There were moments like this one, where strangers could offer support even without knowing all the details of her pain. She didn't have to keep it all inside. Maybe, just maybe, she could start opening up just a little and let others in. With that thought in her heart, Eliza took one last look at the royal guard as he walked away. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in a long time she felt a glimmer of hope that she could face it, one step at a time. The gentle evening breeze had begun to cool the royal square as the celebrations continued in full swing. People milled about, enjoying the music, the delicious food, and the company of friends. But for Eliza, the world felt a little quieter now. The chaos of the day, the weight of grief, and the unexpected kindness of the royal guard had all combined to create a strange calm within her. After the guard had left, Eliza had stayed for a while, quietly observing the crowd. She hadn't realized how much she needed a break from the noise and the expectations that seemed to surround her constantly. The moment with the guard had been brief, but it had left a lasting impression on her, a quiet sense of peace she hadn't known she could still feel. She found herself staring at the royal palace, its towering spires rising above the city, almost as if it were a symbol of strength, something she had once felt she could rely on, but no longer felt connected to. Her thoughts drifted back to her father, The man who had taught her everything about duty, grace, and how to hold her head high even in the hardest times. His absence felt like a hole in her chest that no amount of royal events or bustling crowds could fill. She missed his voice, his steady guidance, his love. As Eliza stood there lost in her thoughts, a voice broke through her melancholy. "Would you like to take a walk in the gardens, miss?" It was the guard. Captain Lucas, as she now remembered from his uniform, had returned to her side, this time with a slight smile on his face. His voice was calm, but there was a warmth in it that she hadn't noticed before. Eliza hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to accept. She had been so absorbed in her sorrow that she hadn't considered how the simple act of walking could clear her mind. Yet there was something about this man, something kind and patient that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be such a bad idea. I think that sounds nice," Eliza said, her voice soft but her words filled with a small sense of hope she hadn't felt in a while. Without saying much more, Captain Lucas motioned for her to follow him. They didn't walk quickly or in silence. Instead, their steps were slow and the pace was calm. As they moved away from the grand square, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background, and they entered the serene quiet of the royal gardens. The gardens were just as beautiful as Eliza remembered from her childhood. Lush greenery, colorful flowers in full bloom, and tall trees that provided shade as they lined the winding paths. The evening air was crisp but comforting, with a light fragrance of jasmine and roses wafting through the air. The garden, in its peaceful stillness, felt like a world apart from the bustling city outside the walls. Eliza walked beside Captain Lucas, who remained silent but attentive as though giving her the space to gather her thoughts. For the first time in weeks, Eliza felt the weight of her grief begin to lift just a little. There was something grounding about the garden, the simplicity of the flowers, the soft rustling of the leaves, and the quiet murmur of the distant fountain that brought her a sense of calm. They walked for several minutes, the silence between them not uncomfortable but rather understanding. Eliza found herself looking around, taking in the beauty of the surroundings, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in a long time. Her mind had been so consumed by grief and expectations that she had forgotten how to appreciate the world around her. Finally, Captain Lucas spoke, breaking the silence once again. "It's nice here, isn't it? The gardens always help me clear my head after a long day." Eliza glanced at him, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected the royal guard to care about such things. Guards were supposed to be strong, disciplined, and focused on their duties. But here he was, a man who saw the value in finding a quiet moment to reflect, just like she did. "Yes," Eliza replied, her voice soft but genuine. "It's beautiful." They continued walking, the path leading them deeper into the garden where the trees were taller and the flowers even more vibrant. The quiet seemed to settle into Eliza's bones, and she realized how much she had needed this. Needed to be away from the weight of the royal events, the expectations placed on her, and the loneliness that had been creeping into her life. Captain Lucas seemed to sense her shifting thoughts. "I know what it's like," he said after a pause, his voice steady. "To feel like there's no one to lean on, no one who really understands." Eliza looked at him, surprised by his honesty. She had never really considered that someone like him, a royal guard, strong and composed, might have struggles of his own. He seemed so distant from her world, yet in that moment, she realized that they weren't all that different. Both of them had burdens. Both of them had to carry the weight of expectations. Eliza began, her voice hesitant. "I've always been told to be strong, to always stand tall, to never let anyone see my weakness." Captain Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a lot of pressure for anyone. It's hard, even for those who seem unshakable." Eliza was surprised by the warmth in his voice, by the fact that he was sharing such personal thoughts with her. She had never expected to have a real conversation with a royal guard, let alone one about struggles and burdens. For so long she had been trapped inside her own grief, believing that no one could understand her pain. But here, walking through the gardens with this man, she felt as if someone finally saw her for who she truly was. Not the noble woman trying to keep up appearances, but just a person struggling with her own losses. "I've lost so much," Eliza said quietly, her words trembling slightly. "And I feel like I'm drowning in it sometimes. I don't know how to keep going, how to move forward without him." Captain Lucas didn't interrupt or offer empty words of reassurance. Instead, he listened. His quiet attention was more comforting than any well-meaning words could have been. After a moment he spoke again. It's okay to feel lost. Sometimes it's okay to not have all the answers. The important thing is that you don't have to face it alone. You're allowed to lean on others, even if it's just for a little while. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat as his words settled in her heart. The guard's kindness, his understanding, was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She had spent so much time trying to be strong, trying to carry everything by herself, but Captain Lucas had reminded her that it was okay to ask for help, to take a step back and find a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos. They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sounds now the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the gentle hum of nature. Eliza felt lighter, as though the heavy burden she had been carrying was starting to ease. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite as alone. As they reached the far end of the garden, the evening sky had turned into a deep shade of purple, and the stars had begun to twinkle above them. The celebration in the square seemed so far away now, like a distant memory, and Eliza realized that in that moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. With a quiet sigh, she turned to Captain Lucas and gave him a small, thankful smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for this, for being here." Captain Lucas gave her a respectful nod, his expression gentle. "I'm glad I could help, miss. Sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference." Eliza smiled again, this time a little more freely. She wasn't entirely healed, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she had a small piece of hope to carry with her.